All systems go. Well, thank you guys for inviting me this morning. Thank you for this opportunity just to share my story with you this morning. In preparation for this morning's talk, I found myself just going through some of my old prayer journals, just to remind myself really of my journey and all the ways that God has just continued to prove his faithfulness to me, really. I think it's such an important practice, isn't it, to keep a personal record of all his fulfilled promises in our lives, as it can really build up our faith when life inevitably gets tough, because it always does. Yeah. So in thinking about my talk this morning, I thought if I had to give my talk a title, what would it be? And I think it would be Facing the Mountain. Waiting, leaping and trusting, but facing the mountain. So what mountain did I have to face? Well, I grew up in a Christian home. I was the youngest of three. My father was a Baptist church minister, so attending church and Bible class, Sunday school, youth fellowship, that was my normality. My father's church was in a very deprived area in Scotland with many really poor, desperate, needy people. And the transformation I witnessed in their lives as they came to know God was continually apparent. I've never doubted the reality or even the existence of God in my life. He's always been very real to me. And I remember sitting in the pews as a wee girl every Sunday asking Jesus to come into my heart every week, just to make sure he was there. You know, both my parents were good people, but like most people, they were broken people. And their brokenness manifested in different ways. My father was utterly devoted to God and equally devoted to his congregation, which unfortunately resulted in his absence a lot from the family home. My mother, because of her own upbringing and her own emotional issues, developed chronic depression and was soon hospitalised. As 40 odd years ago, there was a real lack of understanding of mental illness. So that's what they did. They just put you in hospital. So emotionally growing up, I didn't really have a lot of support. And it's only in hindsight, as I look back, I can see that this lack of support probably contributed to some of my future choices. So from quite a young age, I began searching for that support, that attention that I felt I just really wasn't getting, that I so desperately craved. I experimented with lots of recreational activities, so to speak, looking for that acceptance and for someone to just meet my emotional needs that were not being met. So, of course, I eventually met a guy nearly 10 years older than me who seemed to fit the bill exactly. He was just as crazy as I was, and he drank, if not more than I did, and was just as outrageous. We were the perfect match. Bearing in mind, I was still only 17. Stuart was 26. So some psychologists might argue he was a substitute father figure, as he swept me off on foreign holidays and I quickly moved into his Edinburgh flat where we could party to our heart's content. Despite our age difference, Stuart's family were very welcoming. And at that young age, I revelled in the freedom that they allowed me to behave in any way I chose. They appeared in stark contrast to my own family, who I viewed as too strict and too uptight, and in my immature opinion at the time, had set too many boundaries. Stuart loved to travel, and before meeting me, he just returned from 6 months in Australia, and he was getting itchy feet to hit the road once more. The thought of a life with no boundaries and no responsibilities and nobody to answer to was all too attractive, so I gave up all thoughts of college and followed this man into my future. You may be wondering what my dear Christian parents were doing whilst we were living and working in a seedy bar in the red light district in Rhodes in Greece. They were doing the only thing that faith-filled parents can do. They were continually praying for my safety and that God would bring something into my life that would bring me home and set my feet back on solid ground. Stu and I had left the UK for good. We had no intention of coming back. We had only been away 6 months when God answered my parents' prayer in the most unexpected way only God can. I was 19 and just found out I was pregnant. So I had to make the hard decision to go home. Like any other teenager, that phone call home to my parents was nerve-wracking. But the tears they shed unexpectedly were tears of joy. She'll be all right now, were my father's words, always trusting, always believing that God's hand never left me, not for a moment, and that God knew the plans he had for me. Plans to prosper me, plans not to harm me, plans to give me a hope and a future. As I returned to the UK, I soon realised my father was very ill and was actually dying. I'll always be so grateful for those last few months we had together. It was a time of such healing and forgiveness and shared laughter. Another example of God's perfect timing. If I hadn't been forced to go home when I did, I would have missed out on those precious moments and would have probably carried with me, I'm sure, a burden of guilt for the rest of my life. As my father predicted, I was okay. Stu and I got married and we went on to have two beautiful children, whom I was determined to be there for no matter what. But there was something destructive lurking beneath the surface that would indeed prove to be my mountain. As I turned from young, naive teenager to a young adult with two of my own children, seeking, as most parents do, to give them the best environment to thrive, I began to want a different kind of life. I didn't want the partying and the drinking lifestyle anymore. I was growing up, but unfortunately, my husband was being left behind. As I was scraping together the coins to pay for the bills, he was scraping together enough money for the bottles of wine or any other cheap booze he could afford. The relaxed attitudes his family had around drinking, which I once found so freeing, I now understood were because his was a family steeped in alcoholism. I began to feel trapped. Stuart now worked in the oil industry and spent weeks away from home, which did give me the space to rediscover my faith and start going back to church. On his time off with no work to occupy him, he would be in party mode for 5 weeks straight. When an opening to move overseas as a family with Stu's work arose, I saw this as an opportunity to break the cycle of a divided life, and I'd hoped that being in a constant work environment for Stu would mean less drinking. Our first expatriate move was to Nigeria, where, as you can imagine, life had its challenges. But instead of the drinking lessening, it was only heightened with more parties, dinner, formal balls, and beach days, all evolving around the drinking culture I'd so longed to leave behind. I felt I was fighting a losing battle, and I soon found myself slipping back into the very drinking culture I tried to defeat. My motto seemed to say, if you can't beat them, join them. So this merry-go-round continued. We moved countries, made friends, moved countries, made friends, got jobs, partied hard, and again and again and again. I was on autopilot, always thinking in the back of my mind that as soon as the kids were old enough, I would leave my husband. Yes, I was still drinking too, but there's drinking and then there's drinking. And I now know the difference between my drinking and my husband's drinking is a stop button. I had one, my husband didn't. I now know that alcoholism is a disease. My husband had this disease. I didn't. I wasn't the alcoholic, but I was still living a lie. I was depriving myself of being who God created me to be. I still had such an ache in my heart to live differently, not this life fueled by alcohol. I could literally feel the emptiness in my heart that was once filled with my God. I could literally feel the ache in my heart of the years I'd wasted with my back turned towards God. God knew my name. He knew me before I was even born. I longed to feel his shelter and to know again the safety in the shadow of his wings. So it's 2015, we're living in Dubai, and I hit rock bottom. I couldn't live like this anymore. I was so far from God, and I kept saying, if only so-and-so would happen, then all will be okay. In some ways, I felt like the woman who just couldn't stop bleeding in Matthew 9. I had to reposition myself. I had to get close to God. I had to push and shove and elbow my way through my fears. I felt exhausted, emotionally drained, yet I couldn't give up. I had to face my mountain. Over the years, I'd given my husband so many ultimatums to stop drinking. I'd emptied bottles of booze down the drain, thrown bottles in the garbage, only to find it being replaced again and again. I'd threatened to leave him, knowing full well I had nowhere to go. I'd endured nights that had turned into humiliating spectacles. Mornings of utter shame, and the loneliness of carrying this burden alone had become unbearable. I'd found a church by this time in Dubai, and was going regularly. Slowly, I began to realise that I was powerless over the alcohol in my husband's life, and that the only power I had was over my own life, and that I was responsible for my life and my actions, no one else's. I couldn't control my husband's drinking. I had to hand it over to God and allow him to take charge of the situation. I was beginning to face my mountain, and I was beginning to trust that maybe God was bigger than this mountain. I gave my husband one last ultimatum. He could choose me or the drink, but he couldn't have both. He could see in me something had changed. This wasn't the false threats of the past. There was some resolve in my countenance that wasn't there before. I resonated with the madman in Mark 5, the man who'd lived amongst the dead, dry bones, a life where there is no life, chained by a culture and a disease that was out of my control. I knew Jesus' name, and I ran to him. I put my trust in him. My husband chose the drink, and it was the most crushing experience I've ever had to endure. At the age of 41, after 13 years of living overseas, and we'd lived in 9 different countries and 20 years of marriage, I packed my bags and I went to live in my brother's spare room back in the UK, even though I felt broken, and I grieved the end of my marriage and all the hopes and dreams I'd had for my future. I knew I'd taken a great leap of faith. I had no idea how to move forward or what life would be like alone. All I could do was live one day at a time and trust God for that one day. My brother lives in Surrey, and his spare room looked out over a large meadow, which became my sanctuary. I spent my mornings in prayer and soaking in God's presence. It became a very special time of healing. And slowly I began to sense God asking me, what is it you want? Just as he asked the blind man in Luke 18, what do you want me to do for you? I remembered the verse in Joel chapter 2, verse 25. Restore to me the years the locusts have eaten. That's what I wanted. I slowly began to make a new life for myself in London. I got a new job, I bought a flat, my son moved in with me, and I made regular trips back to Dubai to visit my daughter, who was still at uni there. Stu seemed to be worse than ever, losing all sense of sobriety. Now he had no one to be accountable to. He'd lost everything, and he buried his own pain deeper and deeper in the bottom of a bottle. I continued growing in my faith and trusting that all things would work together for good. I was heartbroken seeing my beloved Stu so lost, and I prayed for him every day. After all, he was the love of my life. He was my best friend. I persevered in praying that God would restore to me the years the locusts had eaten. I felt my family had been ripped apart, and I longed for restoration. In the beginning of February 2016, I wrote in my journal just 5 words. I want my family back. Later that week, I received a call from Stu saying he'd gone to an AA meeting and he was going to try and stop drinking. I wasn't really impressed. Later that month, I visit my daughter in Dubai. I see Stu. He seems really different. He's not drinking. He's going to 3 or 4 AA meetings a week. I'm moderately impressed. He asks me to come with him to a meeting. I'm nervous, imagining cold basements filled with seedy alcoholics. I'm a little bit unsure how I'm meant to behave. However, it felt like being in church. It was just normal people talking about their brokenness and their need to make amends and turn their will and their lives over to the care of a God of their own understanding. Stuart shared openly that night about his guilt, his shame, losing his family, and his desire to put things right and his longing to have his family back. That night was a turning point for us. For the first time I saw he had a real desire for change and he really wanted to make amends. I cancelled my flight back to the UK and I trusted that this was the beginning of God restoring the years the locusts had eaten. That was 5 years ago now. Stuart, as a recovering alcoholic, is still going to AA, but has just celebrated 5 years of sobriety. We're both involved in helping other addicts and their families suffering the effects of alcoholism and others addicts. So that's my journey so far, but God hasn't finished with me yet. I'm busy studying a degree in psychology and counselling so that nothing is wasted, and that God will continue to restore to us the years the locusts have eaten, and continue to strengthen us both, so that no matter what other mountains we face, we know that our God is so much bigger than they are. Amen.
Amen.
Story. So you're welcome to ask any questions, whatever you like. So I hope you're encouraged.
Oh, I'm sure we are. It's such a powerful journey to walk with you there. And you know, it's when someone shares it in 20 minutes or 25 minutes or whatever, we all know it's over a longer period of time, and you know, the depth and emotion and everything is so much deeper. How imperative were those early years, I think. That mountain, you know, that you were facing, and valleys and everything, just so important. What was happening at the foothills in the beginning of that, you know, to be able to get you through that, value of that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think when I look at my grounding that I had as a child compared to my husband's, both his parents are alcoholic and his brother's an alcoholic.
Right.
So that's this normality. And as I said, my normality was going to church and seeing his life being transformed. That was my reality. And so very different, such a contrast.
Yeah.
Joy, I would like to thank you for being so courageous to tell us your story. It's a story of pain. Sorry, I can't put my. I have to say to you that God is answering my prayers through your speech. He is real. And I just want to thank you for being so honest and for being such a sad story, but with a joyful ending.
Bless you, Maria.
And I think it's so beautiful how you're redeeming all of the pain. You know, God is redeeming that pain. You're opening yourself up to using that for other people, which I think is so beautiful too, because there's so many times when you see people and they've suffered and they've turned inward in their grief, and they deny God and they say, if I had to go through that, you know, how would God allow me to go through that? But yet you decided to turn to God in it and say, what can you do with this? What can you do through me and this pain, and use this pain? And now you're helping others, which is so beautiful too. Thank you for, again, I echo that. Thank you for sharing and being so transparent. Yeah.
Something else I want to say is that there is power, incredible power in your words, because it's a real life with a real God in a real experience. Thank you again. Do not stop sharing your story. If you have other opportunities, I would suggest you share your story in other groups, because you never know who is in need of listening to this.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, Stuart's not a Christian, but he is on a spiritual path, because the AA 12-step principles is a spiritual program, you know, and so he's learning to even find a God of his own understanding in his own way. And he's back at work now. He works in Algeria at the moment. And I told him last night, this is what I was doing. And he said, oh, can you tell me what you're sharing? And so, you know, even saying that to him, he said he had a little cry, because I typed it out, obviously, and sent it to him. And he said, oh, I had a little cry. And so it is important, I think, that we are transparent and we are honest, because, you know, just reading the Gospels, it's about broken people and God touching these broken people. And if we're open with our brokenness, that's where God's power is really evident. And I think that's when I first went into that first AA meeting and I saw how honest people were. On the one hand, I thought it's so like church because we're broken people. But on the other hand, I thought, do you know what? It's better than church because they're hiding nothing. There's no masks. They're just raw. And there was that raw integrity of honesty. And it was overpowering. And I still occasionally go with Stu to meetings, but families and friends of alcoholics have their own support group called Al-Anon. And so I'm involved in that as well on a weekly basis. But it's a healing journey. You know, we talk about the alcoholic being in recovery, but I'm in recovery too because of the years. And I think even as Christians, because addicts talk about themselves as being in recovery, you know, when they're seeking to follow the 12-step principles. And I always think we as Christians should say that. You know, we as Christians should talk about we're in recovery. I'm in recovery, walking alongside Jesus. He's healing me because that is our journey. You know, we are on a journey of healing and recovery on a day-to-day basis. And we'll never be completely healed in this life. You know, never. So we should always be in recovery and seeking that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's important to keep sharing, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just like to also say, Joy, thank you for what you've shared very well openly. But I think, you know, that wonderful verse that you quoted from Joel 2 is, or whatever it was from, is so important to pray for the years, you know, that the locusts have eaten. And, you know, it's just really outlining again, emphasizing the importance of praying, you know, to God and how he hears and answers our prayers. And I'm glad that time I did contact you, and from that day until today, I pray every morning for Stuart's salvation.
Thank you.
You know, I think this is so important for all of us who have close family members who are outside of Christ, that, you know, to keep on praying and praying and praying and trusting God, you know, that he will help us in our lifetime to see many of these loved ones of ours, whether it's a daughter, whether it's a husband, or cousins, or whatever family members and other friends coming to know Jesus as Savior and Lord of their lives. So just like to encourage you very much for sharing that, and just emphasizing how important prayer is, and to, you know, to keep on praying and praying and praying, never to give up. Just a wee verse that's on top of my diary that I was just looking at as I was talking to Yaz earlier on this morning, and it's from 2 Chronicles 15:7. Be strong and do not give up, for your work will be rewarded. Now that was encouraging to my heart as I go through many struggles this morning, but also just wanted to share that with all of you, and especially Joy there this morning, not to give up, to be strong, because our work will be rewarded. And that's just a very powerful verse there this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene.
Irene, could you give us that verse again, please? Chronicles.
2 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 7.
Shall we look it up? In case you want to mark it in your Bibles, let's do it now rather than often we can forget.
Oh gosh, my paper tip.
So let's see.
2 Chronicles.
Chronicles 15. I'm going to look it up myself.
My Bible says, but as for you,
yeah,
be strong, and do not give up.
Yeah.
For your work will be rewarded.
That's it. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
There's a good memory verse to learn this week, ladies.
Yeah.
And what was yours again, Joy? The Joel one. I love that verse as well.
Joel 2:25.
25.
And it's funny because that verse I don't even know where I heard it from, but I just knew the verse, like,
Yeah.
restore the years of locusts of decently. And I kept it for years in my heart. And I never even knew where in the Bible it was. I actually had to Google it at one point and go, where is this verse? But it was just imprinted on my heart for such a long time. So it's amazing how, I must have heard it or known about it when I was a child, and it was there, the seed had been planted. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
I think it's a very popular one, isn't it? That one. I remember hearing that when I first became Christian. I love that nothing is wasted.
Yeah.
Like absolutely nothing is wasted in our lives in this kingdom. I agree that brokenness is really a point of touching other lives. It's not about God's brought me to a place of perfection. I think it's really important to be transparent that we are broken. And the Bible is full of brokenness. His body was broken and brought restoration. And when he broke the bread to feed the 5,000, he had to break something, but then he brought wholeness and food and to thousands. And then the other one I was thinking of, when she came and broke the alabaster pot, and she broke it, and then this perfume and resonated to the whole room, and I'm sure more further. And she wiped his feet, and just, that symbol of, recognizing you are the King, you're the Messiah. So brokenness is, it's a constant, isn't it? It's a constant in life. And we can touch people's lives by sharing our brokenness that way. Yeah.
Because some people want to bottle it up and say, no, I'm not broken. See, I can put on, like, as Pam was saying the other week, put on the mask. I'm all good. It's everything's fine. It's all fine. It's not. It's not. And I like how you said that about the group. There was a rawness to it because they weren't trying to hide anything. They were broken, and I'm sure many of them had hit like rock bottom where they couldn't hide anything anymore. And so it was just all out there. And there's beauty in that because we all understand that we are broken. And none of us can truly hide. We might try, but it doesn't work because we all know all of us make mistakes. We're all broken.
Yeah. Joy, I have a question for you. How long did it take from the time you, in a sense, you left the Lord? Because I think you did know the Lord before 17. How long did it take you to come back to the Lord?
It's quite a difficult question, really, because even though my life wasn't in line with leading a godly life, I still had faith, and I still knew his presence. And so I felt in some ways I was a yo-yo. At 17, I kind of left the church and met Stu, and then I had the children. Then I went back to the church for a while, and I went to an Alpha group, and I got baptized. And then I moved overseas to Nigeria, and that's when I kind of sunk back into the whole sort of drinking culture. I couldn't cope with it anymore, and so I just thought, oh well, I'll just go his way then. And there was no real church that I could find in Nigeria. I just felt as if I'd maybe lost my church support. And so from then, it was probably a good 13 years that it took me until I really went back seeking God 100% and putting God first in my life again. So yeah, a long time. But I think it was just after my son was born, so I was 19, 20, when I realised that Stuart and his family were alcoholics. And that's when I suddenly got, well, oh my word, what have I got into? What do I do now? And so from that age until 41, really, so 20 years, I really battled with his alcoholism. Because in my family, you know, even though, as I said, my father's church was in a very poor area, and we saw a lot of addicts and alcoholics in the area, but there were people that had come out of prison. You know, my mum was a prison chaplain as well, and so in my head, addicts were criminals. They weren't middle class families, you know, and so it was an alien world to me, the alcoholism. And so when I met Stuart's family and they were pouring me wine and offering me cigarettes, and it was a party atmosphere every time we went round there. So I thought this was great fun. I thought they were great, but they had no boundaries. They had no boundaries. And as a 17-year-old, you think that's great.
Yeah.
Joy. Marina wants to say something. Joy.
Yes.
Where this time that you were like Jojo, you said, where were your children?
They were with us. They were with you. Yeah, they were with us. And the time.
So you had this burden and you had the husband. So you were loaded double.
I tried to hide it from my children for a long time. I tried to hide it. Sometimes we would come in and my husband would be face planted on the floor, and I would go in and see him, and I'd have to take my kids somewhere else so that they wouldn't see their dad. But as they got older, I couldn't hide it.
Children know. They are very clever.
Yeah.
You cannot hide from them much.
No. And so then I have the guilt of lying to my kids, because even though I knew they were still too young to maybe discuss it, and at the time I still didn't really have any support. The support I have nowadays with Al-Anon and AA, I didn't have that back then, so I didn't understand the disease. And so it becomes a shame game. Which is awful, because then you have that guilt as well. And then as the kids get older, they learn to play off against one another with the mom and with the dad and the blame. And in AA, we talk about it being a family disease. And I can see that in my husband's family, because that was his conditioning. And so that really is a concern. As my children, they've seen it, they've experienced it. And I just really pray that it's broken, that this hereditary disease is broken. I can see certain traits in both my children. You know, my daughter doesn't drink, she's 24, and she's very against it. She's gone the other way. But my son goes in and out of episodes of not drinking, not drinking. And it's because I know that I think he'll drink too much, and then he'll go, oh, I shouldn't do that, because he's afraid. But I think I can see traits in my son. So that's worrying. It's very worrying.
But you must have had hope. You must have had hope, some kind of, that you had God in the background all the time. You never lost him.
Yeah.
Even if past 13 years, you had him. And the hope. And this is very important, of course. This can save. And this saves, as we see from your story.
Yeah. And I think more importantly, God had me. I was in his care. I was in his hands. And so even in the 13 years that I maybe felt alone and felt that I wasn't walking with God, he was walking with me.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important, to encourage people when they feel that you know, they're alone and they feel maybe abandoned and they feel isolated. That they're not. They're not. But sometimes we need to just turn. We need to turn. And as I said, thinking about the woman who was bleeding, you know, she had to push through the crowd. She had to reposition herself from where she was, and she had to reach out. And so it does always take for us to do something, you know, whether that's reaching out or stepping out of the boat or touching the hem of Jesus' cloak. We have to do something. We have to move. God is always there, but we have to shift and move our position. And I think, well, that is what changed everything. I moved my position.
And Joy, I have another question. When you left your family to be with your boyfriend, did you wish your parents had done something else apart from praying? I know that praying is the most powerful thing that parents can do, but would you think, when you think back, would you say, oh, I wish my parents did this and this and that when I did what I shouldn't have done?
No, not really, because if they had tried, I was so rebellious at the time, and I had, you know, such strong will that they wouldn't have been able to do anything anyway to stop me. And it would just have further damaged our relationship. And so they had to let me go. They had to let me go with their blessing in some ways to maintain that relationship.
Yes.
And it's funny because when I look back on my story, I don't have any regrets. You know, I really don't, because it's brought me where I am, and I believe it's part of my journey, and it's made me who I am. And I am sometimes so grateful that my husband's an alcoholic, because it's brought him on this journey, you know, and it's opened up his eyes and it's softened his heart. You know, it really does. He goes to his meetings all the time and he comes back and he's, you know, enthused and exciting and wanting to help other people, and it's just our journey. And so, no, I don't have regrets, and I'm very grateful that they just gave me their blessing.
Yeah. I understand that.
And in God's timing, I think that's always the important thing. So I think I've shared with you guys before, you know, I used to pray that my husband would just become a Christian and all would be well.
Yeah.
You know? But it doesn't happen like that, does it? It takes years and years and years for transformation and for hearts to melt. And it's only in hindsight now that I can
Well, the Apostle Paul was transformed, you know, within 24 hours. So I think there are some cases, but it's perhaps not everyone.
Yeah, that's right.
Joy.
But we can know that when they are, whoever we're praying for, we can look, it's almost we can look into, wow, look what story they're going to have. Look how God's going to use them when they do find him.
I think that was when we first moved to Nigeria and we started our sort of expat merry-go-round. I think that's one of the reasons I ended up going back into the sort of drinking culture myself, because I felt so alone and so isolated. And then, of course, as you move countries, and I was a personal trainer, so every time I moved countries, I would go to a gym and you would make friends, but it was train hard, play hard, you know, so it just became a cycle. And so my way of coping really was sometimes just to join them. And that's being honest, you know. And of course, I would go for months beating myself up, knowing that this wasn't me, but then I would just get back on the bandwagon. But yeah, it was a very lonely time. It was a very lonely time.
It's such a long time. You're talking about more than 20 years. Incredible. Bless you.
Joy, what about your son and daughter? Do they have faith, or where do they stand?
My son is a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
He has faith, and he was baptized a couple of years ago. He struggles with his own mental health, but both my kids, great, strong, very strong-willed, independent children. My daughter, she's on her own journey. She spent a lot of time in Dubai, and a lot of her friends were Muslim. So she is very sympathetic to lots of faiths, and that's fine. That's where she's at right now. So we're all very open in just discussing, where they're at in their spiritual journey and in their walk. And I just continually pray for both of them, that they will develop a relationship with Jesus for themselves.
Okay, are there any other questions? Anybody want to ask any more questions of Joy before we move into our prayer?
Just like to thank Joy for a very honest I call it a presentation, but your testimony, Joy. I've known you about 6 months, and I would never have guessed all the trials you've been through, because you are such a together person.
Thanks, Rose.
I would say the same as Anne. You're such a together person.
Thank
you. You shine.
Yeah, so wow. Thank you so much, Joy. Yeah, I'm kind of speechless, because it's such a powerful testimony. It's such a powerful testimony. And we all have powerful testimonies too. Like, we just need to speak of what God is doing in our life, and God can use that. And so thank you so much again.
Thank you for letting me share.
All right, ladies, we're gonna move to our prayer.